I emptied my entire savings account to buy a condemned auto repair shop that had been padlocked since 2009, and my parents told me I'd finally managed to flush $40,000 down a toilet that didn't even work. My older sister didn't bother hiding her laugh. She said I was the family embarrassment now, official and permanent. Thought that was the end of it. They thought I'd come crawling back within a month. But 10 days later, when I tore open the wall behind the old service bay, what I found made every single one of them go quiet for the first time in my life. It turned out my busted garage was sitting on something worth more than their entire company. Before I get into it, tell me in the comments where you're tuning in from tonight. And if you've ever had a family that decided your worth before you even opened your mouth, hit subscribe, because you're going to want to see exactly how this ends. I grew up in a suburb outside Cleveland where my family ran a mid-sized property management company, the kind that owns a dozen strip malls and apartment complexes nobody thinks about until the rent's due. My father, Walter, built it up from 2 buildings into 40 over 30 years, and he ran our house the same way he ran the business, with a very clear org chart. My sister Tessa was the heir apparent. I was the labor. I'm Brielle. I was 29 years old, and for 4 years I had been the one actually running the operations side of that company, while Tessa got her name on the letterhead. I'm the one who renegotiated our insurance contracts after a fire at one of our properties nearly bankrupted us. I'm the one who built the maintenance request system that cut our response time in half. I worked Saturdays. I answered calls at 2 a.m. when a pipe burst in some tenant's unit. I did all of it because my father told me more than once that when he retired the regional manager position, the one that actually ran day-to-day operations across all the properties, was mine. He didn't just say it once. He said it at Thanksgiving in front of my aunt and uncle. He said it again when I turned down a job offer from a competing firm 2 years ago because he asked me to stay. I should have known better. I really should have. It happened on a Thursday, at our quarterly ownership meeting, the one where we walked our investors and silent partners through the numbers. I had spent 3 weeks building the presentation, the new vendor consolidation plan that was going to save us close to $200,000 a year, the proposal to convert 2 of our underperforming retail units into storage rental space, all of it backed by data I had personally pulled and triple-checked. I printed my notes. I rehearsed in my car in the parking lot before walking in. I felt for once like I was about to be seen. My father stood up, welcomed the room, and then turned the floor over to Tessa. I watched my own slides come up on the screen behind her, my charts, my projections. The exact font I use because I think Calibri reads cleaner in a boardroom. She'd taken my final file off the shared drive. I'd sent it to her the night before because she asked to take a look before the meeting, which I now understand meant something very different to her than it did to me. And she'd swapped out the title page. That was it. That was the only edit she made. Everything else was mine, word for word, number for number. She fumbled the vendor contract terminology twice. She called our largest investor by the wrong first name. When someone asked her a direct question about the storage conversion timeline, she froze for a full 5 seconds before giving an answer that wasn't even close to right. And I sat there with my own notes in my lap, watching her get it wrong in real time, unable to say a single word because interrupting her in front of the investors would have looked like I was the problem. Nobody in that room seemed to notice the mistakes mattered. They noticed the confidence. They noticed she looked like the kind of person who belonged at the head of the table, tailored blazer, easy smile, my father's same posture. When she sat down, my father stood up again, beaming in a way I had spent my entire adult life trying to earn from him, and announced that effective immediately Tessa would be stepping into the newly created role of Chief Operating Officer, my role, the one he promised me. He shook her hand. The room applauded. I walked into his office after everyone cleared out. I didn't yell. I asked him, as calmly as I could manage with my hands shaking behind my back, how he could give her a position built entirely on work that was mine. He didn't even look up from his desk at first. When he did, his expression wasn't guilty. It was tired, like I was the inconvenience. He told me Tessa had the presence investors respond to, that I was better suited to the technical side, and that I needed to understand the difference between doing the work and leading the company. He said maybe in a year or 2, if I proved I could be a team player about this, we'd talk about a senior title for me, something with director in it, not co, never co. I asked him what exactly I had been doing for 4 years if not leading the company. He told me I was being emotional, and that emotional people don't run operations for 40 properties. I didn't cry in that office. I want to be clear about that, because for a long time I thought I should have, like that was the appropriate response. Instead, I felt something close down inside me, quiet and permanent, like a door I didn't know I'd been holding open finally swinging shut. I went back to my desk, packed the few personal things I had there into my tote bag, and drove home without saying goodbye to anyone. Over the following week, I did the math on what I actually had. I pulled every dollar out of my 401k early, ate the penalty because I didn't care anymore about a retirement that assumed I'd still be tethered to my family's company at 65. I closed my savings account. I sold the modest set of stocks I'd built up. Altogether, it came to just under $41,000, which sounds like a number until you understand it's also every safety net I had. I'd noticed a property for months without really letting myself think about it. A shuttered auto repair shop on a frontage road on the edge of town, the kind of place most people drive past without seeing. It had been closed since a man named Earl Pruitt died with no children and a lifetime of accumulated junk inside, and the city had been trying to get someone to take it off their hands for over a decade because of the back taxes owed. Nobody wanted it. The roof had a hole in it you could see daylight through. But I'd grown up watching my father evaluate properties, and even with everything falling apart inside me, some part of my brain that he'd trained without meaning to kept running the numbers. That frontage road sat directly on the planned route for a new regional distribution corridor the county had already approved. Most people in town didn't know that yet. I did because I'd pulled the zoning filings myself 2 years ago for an entirely different reason. I met the city's property office in a strip mall coffee shop and signed for it in cash, back taxes included, closing costs included. Walked out holding a deed to a condemned auto shop and a checking account with $400 left in it. That Sunday was our standing family dinner, the one my mother insisted on no matter what, at a steakhouse downtown that my parents had been going to for 20 years, the kind of place where the staff knows your order. I almost didn't go. I went anyway, because some stubborn part of me needed to say this to their faces instead of in a text. They were already at the table when I got there, a bottle of wine open, Tessa glowing from a week of being congratulated by everyone in the company. My mother, Carla, was in her usual pearls, the ones she only takes off to shower. My father was telling a story about a deal he'd closed. I sat down, and before anyone could hand me an assignment for the week, I reached into my bag and slid two things across the table: my resignation letter and underneath it the deed. The table went still. My father picked up the deed first, read the address, and actually laughed, a short, sharp sound, more disbelief than amusement. He asked if I'd lost my mind. He said I'd just handed my entire savings to a worthless lot that the county had been trying to dump on someone for 10 years, that I'd embarrassed myself, that without the family name I was going to be back in my childhood bedroom within a month. My mother set down her wine glass like the gesture itself was a punishment. She said, very quietly, that she didn't know how she was going to explain this to anyone at her book club, that I had always been the difficult one, that this was exactly the kind of impulsive thing she'd warned me about my whole life. She told me, in that same quiet voice, that I was not to bring this up around her friends. Ever. My father's tone shifted from disbelief into something colder. He told me that if I was determined to go play business owner with a condemned garage, I would do it with absolutely none of the company's resources behind me. He said my access to the family accounts, the small trust my grandmother had left for emergencies, the one he controlled, was finished as of that night. He said my health insurance through the company would be cancelled by the end of the month. He said, very plainly, that I had made my choice and now I could live with it alone. I didn't argue. I didn't ask him to reconsider. I just nodded. The check came a few minutes later, dropped into the center of the table in one of those black leather folders. Tessa picked it up first, opened it, and looked at the total, $620, for a meal I'd eaten maybe 4 bites of, and then looked directly at me with a smile that had nothing kind in it. She slid the folder across the table into my lap. First lesson in running your own business, she said. Nobody's going to cover you anymore. They stood up and left 3 of them. Nobody said goodbye. I sat there alone in that overpriced restaurant holding a leather folder with a bill I had no real way to pay. my hands shaking so badly I had to set my water glass down twice before I managed to drink from it. I had $400 in checking and an emergency credit card with a $500 limit, and I was about to spend more than that on a dinner I didn't order and barely touched. I sat with the panic for exactly as long as it took the waiter to come back, and then I put it on the card, signed the slip, and felt something in my chest go hard instead of breaking. They wanted me gone. They wanted me humiliated into coming back and asking for my old desk. I made a promise to myself in that booth with my coat still on, that I would rather lose everything trying than spend one more year being someone's invisible labor. I moved into the shop the next morning. Not figuratively, I genuinely moved a cot and a camp stove into the back office because I couldn't afford both the mortgage on my apartment and the renovation costs, so I broke my lease and ate the fee. The smell when I unlocked that place for the first time was something between motor oil and old rainwater, years of it soaked into the concrete. Earl Pruitt, it turned out, had been something of a hoarder in his last years. Every shelf in that garage was stacked with parts and tools and yellowed invoices going back to the 80s. I spent the first 3 days just hauling debris out to a dumpster I'd rented, no running water, a single drop light run off an extension cord plugged into a neighboring business that let me use their outlet for $10 a day. I worked from before sunrise until I physically couldn't lift anything else. My hands blistered, then calloused. I lost weight I didn't have to lose. Every time my body wanted to quit, I thought about Tessa's face when she slid that check into my lap, and it was somehow enough fuel to keep going another hour. By the end of the first week, I'd cleared the main bay and started on the back storage room, which had taken the worst water damage. The ceiling had partially caved at some point, and the back wall was swollen with black mold. Soft enough that I knew I'd need to tear the drywall out before I could even assess whether the framing underneath was salvageable. I put on a respirator and gloves and started swinging a sledgehammer into a wall that frankly looked like it might collapse on its own if I waited another month. The drywall came apart in wet, heavy chunks, easy work, almost satisfying after a week of just hauling other people's garbage. And then on maybe my 6th swing, instead of the soft crumble I'd been getting, the hammer hit something that didn't give at all. A flat, ringing clang shot up the handle and into my wrists hard enough that I dropped the hammer and stumbled back, ears ringing, certain for a second I'd hit a gas line. It wasn't a gas line. When the dust cleared, I was looking at a sheet of solid steel built directly into the stud wall, about 4 feet wide, clearly not part of any original construction. Somebody had framed this in deliberately, behind a load-bearing wall nobody would ever think to open. I stood there for a long moment just staring at it, my heart going harder than the swinging had earned. It took me 2 more days and a rented oxyacetylene torch, borrowed from a guy 2 units down who fixed lawnmowers and clearly thought I'd completely lost it, to cut through the edge of that plate enough to pry it back. Behind it was a recessed steel box, old, the kind with a combination dial instead of a keypad, bolted into what I'd later learn was actually a poured concrete vault, not just a wall cavity. Earl Pruitt, it turned out, had done some side work decades ago for a regional bank that closed in the 80s and had apparently helped install, and then quietly kept, one of their decommissioned depository vaults when the building was being gutted. I didn't crack it that day. I sat on the concrete floor in front of it until it got dark, then drove 40 minutes to the next town to find a locksmith who specialized in antique safes, because I genuinely did not trust anyone closer to home not to talk. It took him 4 hours. Inside wasn't cash. Earl hadn't been hiding a fortune in bills, which honestly would have been the boring version of this. What was inside was a sealed manila folder of mineral rights documents from the 1960s. Original deeds that had never been recorded with the county because of some clerical lapse during a transfer of ownership decades ago, granting whoever held title to my shop's parcel the subsurface rights to a strip of land running almost 2 miles along that frontage road. Land that, because of an old surveying quirk, included a significant portion of the route the county's brand new distribution corridor was about to be built straight through. Underneath those documents was a second, smaller envelope. Groundwater rights tied to an aquifer that fed 3 of the wells the county had already quietly identified as critical to supplying water for the corridor's planned truck depot and warehouse cluster. In plain terms, whoever wanted to build that corridor was going to need my permission, and my water whether they liked it or not. I sat with a water rights attorney for 2 full weeks before I told a single soul outside that office what I'd found. I had the original documents authenticated. I had the chain of title traced. I learned, slowly and very carefully, exactly how much leverage I was sitting on, and I made sure every piece of it was airtight before anyone in my family knew the garage they'd mocked me for buying was the single most important piece of land in the entire corridor plan. It took about 4 months for the county's announcement to go public, and another 2 weeks after that for my father's company to be approached. Because of course they were approached. Walter's firm had quietly been positioning to win the commercial development contract for the warehouse cluster, going up alongside the corridor, the single biggest deal of his career. And the deal was dead in the water, literally, without my signature on an easement. He called me himself. First time he'd called in 5 months. I let it go to voicemail twice before I picked up, mostly because I wanted to know what his voice sounded like when he needed something from me instead of the other way around. He was almost warm. He talked about family, about how this whole thing had gotten out of hand, about how proud he actually was that I'd landed on my feet with the shop. He worked his way around to it slowly, like I wouldn't notice. There was a small issue with an easement on my property line, nothing major. His legal team would draw up the paperwork. Would I mind signing? I asked him what it was for. He told me in the same tone he used to use when he was explaining a contract to an intern that the county needed access to a strip of my land and a water allocation for a new development his company was building. He said it like a formality. He had no idea I already knew every detail of that project down to the projected revenue. I told him I'd need to see the full scope of the deal before I agreed to anything. He sent over documents 2 days later, heavily summarized, missing the actual financial terms, exactly the kind of paperwork you hand someone you assume won't ask follow-up questions. So I asked follow-up questions. I asked for the unredacted access agreement. I asked for the full hydrology report his engineers had filed with the county. I asked, very specifically, what percentage of revenue his company was projecting from the warehouse cluster over the first 10 years. Because I happened to know, thanks to my attorney, exactly what that number was already going to be. There was a long silence on the phone. Then he asked me, in a voice that had lost all its warmth, what exactly I thought I was doing. I told him I was doing exactly what he'd taught me, running the numbers before I signed anything. It took another 3 weeks of negotiation through my attorney, not me directly, because I genuinely could not sit across from him without wanting to bring up Tessa's promotion, the canceled health insurance, the $620 dinner check. In the end, the agreement gave Walter's company its easement and its water access. And it gave me 15% equity in the development entity formed specifically for the warehouse cluster, plus a permanent water rights royalty that I would collect regardless of what happened to that equity stake later. Structured so that no future deal of his could ever touch it without my signature again. He signed it, he had to. There was no version of that corridor getting built without my name on it. I never went back to work for the family company. I didn't need to. The auto shop itself I eventually renovated properly, real plumbing, a real roof, and converted into an EV charging and rest stop hub sitting directly along the corridor that now funnels truck and commuter traffic past it every single day. Because as it turns out, controlling the water under a major transit corridor also means you get to decide a few other things about how that land gets used. The coffee bar inside does better business some mornings than the diner across the street that's been open for 30 years. Every month, separate from anything to do with my father, a royalty payment lands in an account he has no access to and no say over. I didn't have to manage staff at his company, fight for a title, or sit through another meeting where someone else read my work off a slide. I just had to own something nobody thought to check the walls of. I still see Tessa sometimes at the gas pumps along the corridor, of all places, since her commute to the regional office cuts right past my building now. She doesn't wave anymore. The last time I saw her, she was sitting at the light in a car that wasn't as nice as the one she'd had a year ago, looking straight ahead, and I didn't feel the satisfaction I used to think I'd feel. I just felt finished. My family spent my whole life telling me what I was worth, before I'd ever had the chance to find out for myself. It turned out the answer was sitting behind a wall the whole time, waiting for someone willing enough to swing the hammer and find out.